Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Jang-cho. President Joe Biden will host President Yoon Suk-yeol and Prime Minister Fumio Kishida at the presidential retreat of Camp David. Will the leaders institutionalize the trilateral cooperation into a strategic partnership? Can the commitments withstand political changes? Today, we discuss these issues with former high-level U.S. officials.
その上で、例えば北朝鮮への対応、あるいは法の支配に基づく自由で開かれた国際秩序の維持強化。
And we're going to continue to work closely with those two countries to do everything we can do to help facilitate communication as it pertains to our mutual efforts to ensure regional peace and stability.
In the studio with me, Mr. Sidney Seiler, former National Intelligence Officer for North Korea on the National Intelligence Council until July of this year. Mr. Seiler was the Special Envoy for Six-Party Talks and National Security Council Korea Director during the Obama administration. Mr. Seiler also served as a senior analyst for U.S. Forces Korea. Mr. Seiler has worked on North Korea issues for over 40 years. Also joining us, Mr. Frederick Fleitz, Vice Chair of the Center for American Security at the America First Policy Institute. Mr. Fleitz was the National Security Council Chief of Staff during the Trump administration. Mr. Fleitz was also a CIA intelligence analyst covering WMD proliferation. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Here.
Now, Mr. Seiler, the leaders of the U.S., South Korea, and Japan will meet at Camp David. And China has already blasted in the upcoming trilateral summit, saying that it has always been U.S. desire to form a mini NATO-like military alliance in Northeast Asia. Now, the United States has already established minilaterals in Asia like Quad and AUKUS. Does the U.S. want to elevate U.S., South Korea, Japan trilateral cooperation into a trilateral consultative body?
No, that's a great question. And thank you again for the invitation to come out today. A lot of expectations for the upcoming trilateral summit. It's not surprising. Northeast Asia is a region in which the United States has demonstrated its commitment to the peace and prosperity for several decades, going back to the Korean War. It is also an area that is always marked by some degree of tension. And one of the key ways in order to counter that, of course, is to build those capabilities and those long-standing alliances that we've had, good, successful, historic alliances with great backgrounds with both Seoul and Tokyo, but to take the trilateral cooperation up to the next level, in the reality of the security environment we see there. These types of meetings, the symmetry is so important in Asia, right? The signaling, the demonstrated commitment, and at a time when the lead objectives of both of our potential adversaries in the region, either North Korea or China, is to try to separate us, to try to drive wedges between us, in the case of the PRC, try to isolate Japan, or in the case of North Korea, try to isolate South Korea from the United States. This type of trilateral cooperation demonstrates our commitment at an important time. Moreover, there's practical dimensions to it. There are elements of how we deal with these threats in the region that requires the complementary capabilities that we bring to the table, that our Republic of Korea partners bring to the table, and of course our Japanese partners bring to the table.
Well, I'm also glad to be here, and I agree with everything Sid said. I give the Biden administration a lot of credit for its efforts to promote a closer relationship between the United States, South Korea, and Japan. I think this is being driven by the perception of significantly greater threats from South Korea due to the surge in its missile tests, the preparations for a possible nuclear test, and increasing aggression by China. Now, I agree with Sid, the Chinese are always trying to divide America's allies. It certainly has done a lot to try to divide South Korea and Japan, and China only has itself to blame that these two nations are now uniting against the threat that China and North Korea are causing in the region. And these nations certainly notice that China is doing nothing to rein in North Korea. It is trading with North Korea. It is not standing up to its missile tests. It blocked a vote in the UN Security Council last year on its missile tests. This is a result, this new relationship, and all three nations, but I do give the Biden administration credit for promoting this relationship.
As Mr. Fleitz said, even with Chinese objection, South Korea and Japan and the United States are more closely aligning than before. Now, China has lifted its tour ban on South Korea, Japan, and the United States. Now, in the previous Moon Jae-in administration in South Korea, this is when China imposed tour ban on South Korea, even when the South Korean government balanced between United States and China. And now China has lifted ban. What does this tell us about how South Korea should deal with China? Mr. Seiler.
Well, I think we look at Chinese diplomatic behavior, particularly in terms of its willingness to employ coercive tools such as economic coercion, what we saw with the response to the THAAD deployment, is that there's periods where Beijing feels encouraged to be more aggressive in its behavior, and it feels that a heavy hand and a hardline message serves its interests best in warning neighbors in Asia that there's a high cost to be incurred by having a solid relationship with the United States. And there's other times where they make shifts that are more tactical in nature, that seem to be more conciliatory, less heavy-handed, maybe even some, I don't think they're remorseful necessarily, but they're nevertheless, calculations by Beijing that, in terms of the immediate future, there's a benefit to them of doing what they've done in reducing those tourist restrictions. So, for our Republic of Korea friends, with our allies throughout the world, I mean, the U.S. model is quite clear. The benefits of having a good, solid relationship with the United States to play in the rules-based international order, everything that China's tried to overturn, the value to countries that are having to make these types of decisions of a relationship with the United States should just be so axiomatically clear that we don't need to really do anything beyond that, just other than a steady reminder.
Now, Mr. Fleitz, the previous U.S. administrations have all failed in denuclearizing North Korea and improving human rights situations in North Korea. Do you agree with some views in Washington by Korea watchers that maybe unification led by democratic South Korea is the only fundamental solution to solving the North Korea issue?
Well, I think realistically, unification is a long way off. I don't see there's a chance that North Korea would agree to that in a way that South Korea could agree to in the short term. And I believe that many U.S. presidents have attempted over many years, as you note, to denuclearize North Korea, and they've all failed. I think the Trump administration was the most successful in lowering tensions, at least freezing nuclear tests, freezing most of North Korea's missile tests. It wasn't completely successful. I think one problem was the coronavirus pandemic that made negotiations in 2020 next to impossible. And frankly, I'm confident that if President Trump had been reelected, there would have been more progress on some denuclearization, some normalization effort with North Korea. We won't know. But right now, I don't see reunification as a reasonable solution in the immediate future.
But even though German unification seemed far off, with U.S. strong support to the West Germany, the unification did happen.
I think the two situations really aren't analogous. The Soviet Union fell. There were protests. There were people protesting for freedom in Eastern Europe who wanted to tear the wall down. North Korea is a police state. There are not people who are yearning to join South Korea openly, because if they did, they'd be jailed and killed. It's a different situation. I wish it wasn't different, and I hope we will have a situation one day when there will be a free North Korea that could unite with a free South Korea. But I don't see that in the immediate future.
But at the time, UK and France were fervently against German unification, but with US support, the unification came true in Germany.
Well, Germany wanted to reunify, and we know that all the East European nations, they threw out their communist governments and they became free countries. In the case of Germany, East and West Germany decided to unify. And we can pray that happens in the Korea someday, but I'm pessimistic that's going to happen anytime soon.
Mr. Seiler, do you think there's a fallacy in equating Korean unification with regime change of North Korea? Don't you think people should focus more on freeing North Korean people under authoritarianism and under oppression?
That's a good question. I mean, this comes to, I think, the distinction between regime change and a change in regime behavior or change in the nature of the regime. Now, you could look at North Korea and say that it is inevitable that North Korea is a country that it's the ontological nature. It can't help but be what it is, and that North Korea that is, a supporter of liberal democracy, that introduces free market economics, that respects the human rights of its people and the dignity of its people, and has some degree of freedom that isn't there today, is no longer North Korea. And I understand that argument. And I think that's why, people would say that inevitably for unification along the lines of what, Fred just mentioned, that seems so kind of almost utopian. It's a goal that seems so far off. It needs to begin with a change in internal North Korean behavior in any case. And so I don't think we should ever hesitate to associate ourselves either, officially in terms of our U.S. policy position or as observers of this issue, to somehow fear a change in North Korea that would be, that would result in a Korean Peninsula free of nuclear weapons, free of instability, free of security crises. This is a type of change in the North that we all should be wanting to see. Does that necessarily mean there has to be a regime change? Not by definition, although you could make the argument that ultimately the Kim family system will always be what it is.
Mr. Seiler, do you think the Trump administration's public messaging that it does not seek regime change in North Korea emboldened North Korea?
There were a variety of actions that took place in 2018, and it's hard to describe any of them in particular. But certainly, as you look at where we were in 2016 and 2017, the repeated missile launches in North Korea, the unprecedented cooperation of Russia and China and the Security Council on sectoral sanctions and UNSCRs, writ large, suddenly all changed overnight as North Korea, and I believe, having kind of predicted this shift somewhat in the middle of 2017, that pegged to the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, this was the diplomatic strategy all along, that engaging in diplomacy, probing how much progress could be made with the United States, with South Korea, and even with China and Russia, would immediately mitigate all the momentum we had achieved on sanctions and pressures in 2017. So I wouldn't think that, the assurances that, regime policy was not our regime change was not our policy. We weren't pushing reunification. I think it was a wash. They neither really, in retrospect, advanced Kim Jong-un's fears about U.S. intentions any more than they had been before, nor did sending these signals lessen the credibility of any military pressure we were seeking to exert. So at the end of the day, I don't think they were particularly impactful.
Well, I have strong beliefs on this because I was chief of staff to John Bolton. And you probably know John Bolton wanted to bomb North Korea to the day that President Trump fired him in the fall of 2019. And what I believe happened was that President Trump took a very, very tough approach to North Korea in 2017, even saying on the floor of the UN General Assembly that he would totally destroy North Korea if it threatened America's allies. And I believe this very strong approach drove North Korea to the bargaining table, led to the Singapore summit. And as part of that diplomatic approach, the Trump administration said we're not seeking regime change. They were taking a realist approach. It was the way that President Trump looked at America's enemies to realize when it comes to Putin, when it comes to President Xi, when it comes to Kim Jong-un, America has to be able to live with adversaries and not be plotting to overthrow their leaders and attack them. And I think that was the right approach. It didn't completely succeed, but there aren't good alternatives. The alternative might have been what John Bolton wanted. He wanted to have attacks on North Korea's missile and nuclear programs, which is why they started launching missiles near civilian areas, so there would be civilians killed if the U.S. was to attack a North Korean missile launch. So I don't think that this emboldened North Korea, but we really won't know what happened. You know, would Trump's effort to engage North Korea, the personal diplomacy, would that have ultimately succeeded in the second term, as I said earlier? We just don't know.
But the fact that the U.S. government didn't keep the pressure on North Korea and eased all the sanctions on North Korea, that meant North Korea developed the weapons more. There are some criticisms about that.
Well, we had the heads of both nations saying that they wanted to denuclearize North Korea at 3 separate meetings, 2 summits and then the meeting at the DMZ. Then when it got to the lower level meetings, there was no cooperation. The North Korean officials didn't want to budge. And this still is a bit of an enigma for me. I'd love to hear Sid's view on why that was. And I know that we try to put pressure on the North Koreans to fulfill the commitments that leader Kim seemed to make when he met with President Trump, and then his leaders didn't make. But I'll tell you another problem is I think that below the president and the U.S. government, I don't think there was agreement on how to approach North Korea. I think sometimes lower level U.S. officials gave mixed signals to the North. And I think that played into the hands of hardliners.
Now, before I move on to other questions,
Yeah.
I must ask you about the latest national intelligence estimate on North Korea. North Korea Kim Jong-un says North Korea has to sharpen its war plans and has to modernize its weapons for war preparations. For the NIE to think that North Korea will only use nuclear weapons for coercive use and not for offensive use, isn't it too complacent?
That's a great question, and my first statement would be overwhelmingly no. In fact, the intent of the NIE, as we coordinate, it's an intelligence community coordinated product. It's coordinated all the way up to the heads of agencies who sign off on the final version. And we teed up 3 potential scenarios, what I used to call the responsible, rogue, and revisionist North Korea, or the defensive, coercive, offensive use of nuclear weapons. And in teeing this up, we looked at, first of all, to put these as 3 at least viable enough to address analytically possibilities, and then look among those 3 which was the most likely. And so our conclusion that the coercive was the most likely does not mean we don't have to worry about the offensive or the revisionist, or the idea that there's a set of strategic goals, maybe not unification, but a major shift in the balance of power on the peninsula where North Korea's dominance is established. The U.S.-ROK alliance is broken. We are driven off, the U.S. is driven off the peninsula, and the ROK is forced to pay compensation for North Korea claimed injustices over the past several decades, fundamentally much to the detriment of the Republic of Korea and much to the advancement of North Korea, that possible use of nuclear weapons, particularly if Kim Jong-un sees how Vladimir Putin gets away with at least the threat of weapons, God forbid at some point, or the use, if Kim Jong-un were to be encouraged that he could get away with this is something we need to be concerned about. This is something we need to be planning for. Mm-hmm. This needs to be the focus of our deterrence discussions.
Right.
How do we keep Kim from being delusional?
Right.
So I don't think our NIE in any way says we don't have to worry about the North Korea. It's quite the contrary.
Right. Mr. Fleitz, you were chief of staff at Trump White House, and President Trump in 2016 said, when he was the Republican presidential frontrunner, said that he might support Japan and South Korea develop their own nuclear weapons rather than relying heavily on the United States. Now, President Trump continues to dominate the Republican primary. In this context, will South Korea getting a nuclear weapon end the U.S.-South Korea alliance?
Well, this is an interesting question, especially since President Yoon raised the idea earlier this year, which really upset the Biden administration, set into place significant efforts to engage North Korea and to work on enhanced security assurances. I don't think it would end the alliance because we have very significant security concerns with China, and North Korea would not go away. Also, it would be difficult, assuming South Korea could ever develop nuclear weapons, which would take a long time. North Korea is way ahead of them in developing them. China has a much larger arsenal. We don't know how large. I think South Korea developing nuclear weapons would be very destabilizing. I understand why President Yoon has raised the issue, why South Korea is saying that maybe we have to do this to defend ourselves. But no, I don't think it would end the alliance.
You said it's destabilizing, but from President Trump's perspective, if South Korea gets more stronger deterrence by itself, then that's less burden for United States. And wouldn't South Korea getting a nuclear weapon be a natural deterrence against China and make United States worry less about North Korea?
I don't think a South Korean nuclear weapon would deter the Chinese. I think it would significantly increase instability in Asia, and it would really hurt relationships between South Korea and China. But I mean, look, President Trump is not a man with a significant foreign policy background. He speculates on things and sometimes he changes his mind. I'm not sure that's where he is right now, that South Korea and Japan should develop nuclear weapons. And if they did, it would lower the burden on the United States. He said other things about pulling U.S. troops out of South Korea and Japan, which he later walked back. He's a businessman and he delves in national security, but sometimes he makes corrections.
And, you know, real quickly, with all of those, by the way, President Trump generated, it may have been unorthodox, it may have been, diplomatically, challengeable, but he generated a debate on issues that are longstanding issues. How much should ROK be paid for the U.S. protection security umbrella? Why do we have forces there? What's their value? What would happen if we had forces off the peninsula and a nuclear Japan and Korea? That's not the same as advocating those positions, but it did open a discussion that I think continues to today.
So, Mr. Seiler, you're known to be U.S. official most fluent in Korean language. We are aware that North Korean and South Korean officials watch this program. Would you like to give North Koreans a message in Korean language through here?
북한 지도자나 북한 주민들한테 전하고 싶은 메시지는 미국의 한반도의 안정, 대한민국의 안보에 대한 그 헌신, 커미트먼트는 하나도 흔들림이 없을 거라고 생각합니다. 앞으로 북한은 핵무기 통해서 무슨 압도적인 그 위치를 취하거나 협박하거나 무슨 그 한미 관계를 깨뜨리는 그런 효과가 나으리라고 생각하면은 거기서는 그런 착각에서 벗어나야 한다고 생각합니다. 그래서 앞으로는 북한은 다시 한번 핵무기 통해서 얻은 것은 얼마나 없는 것은 깨닫고 협상의 테이블로 나왔으면 하는 마음입니다.
Well, on that note, we will continue our discussion next time. Mr. Fleitz, Mr. Seiler, thank you very much for joining us.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.